us, and welcome to all of you. I know how many different activities there are. Annie knows precisely how to get on our good side. She called Carter young and me distinguished. So what more could we ask for? I wanted to start off because, and ask Carter a question. He graduated here, as you know, in 1988. And he worked at Procter Gamble, and then he worked at Gillette, then went to work for the Nature Conservancy. So I could understand moving from Procter Gamble to Gillette, but would you tell us a little bit about that journey from Gillette to Nature Conservancy? It doesn't seem like the exact career path that one would expect.
No, and I first of all, thanks for having me here. And my roommate in business school is actually in the audience and can tell you that even when I was working at Procter Gamble and Gillette, my great love was the outdoors, and I would spend as much time as possible in the White Mountains. Actually, Andy Founder's in the audience, who is the head of the Appalachian Mountain Club. And I ended up volunteering a lot with the AMC, working on various projects, but I spent a lot of time climbing and in the outdoors, and it was a predictable moment. We'd be sitting on top of one of the White Mountains, and I would turn to Michael and I'd say, God, what am I doing with my life? And it actually became quite tiresome. But it was clear, at least to me, that the thing that I really cared the most about was the environment, and was really looking for a way to make a difference. And when I came out of business school, I remember going up to the Nature Conservancy and I asked them to hire me. And they said, we're looking for lawyers and we're looking for scientists. And I was neither. And I kept at it. I ended up starting as a volunteer with the Appalachian Mountain Club. And then when the opening came up with the Nature Conservancy, I interviewed and I got the job. And then I proceeded to screw things up royally. But we can talk about that.
Just curious, how unusual a phenomenon was that when you graduated from business school to go into the nonprofit sector, and how many of your classmates currently are serving in the nonprofit sector?
Oh God, when I was here, the one speech I remember, the one speaker was Milliken. I don't know if any of you remember Michael Milliken, the inventor of junk bonds, and that he was the hottest speaker, and everyone was going to Goldman Sachs, everyone was going to Wall Street, and I remember him speaking. I didn't understand a word he said. I recall later why I didn't understand a word he said, because some of it didn't completely make sense. But it was, I think maybe 2 or 3 other students at that time were even interested in the topic.
And now have many of them migrated into the social sector?
A few. And I've been really interested since I was here. John Whitehead started this program. It's really grown. Now we've got professors who teach this program, and my mentor, John Sawhill at the Nature Conservancy, taught here. And so it's really exciting to see how much it's grown.
Carter, would you give us some insight when you made the transition and in your career now, just how different are the two sectors from a leadership management point of view, and how disruptive was it? Could you use your MBA skills when you went into this social sector?
So I'll describe my first 3 years at the Nature Conservancy, which was this young Harvard MBA coming into this organization. Everyone was older than me. They were all scientists. They'd spent their careers saving the planet. And I was going to come in and shake things up. I didn't listen to people very much. I thought that I could just mandate change in the organization. And it was a disaster. And as Michael could tell you, it was a really hard time for me. And what I learned at that moment was, one, I learned a lot about listening and listening to people in the organization I worked for. I also learned a lot about the role of a leader, which is, at least in the nonprofit sector, is more about inspiring people to do great things than it is about mandating things. And the last thing I learned, and this was actually using some of the skills here, was how to begin to build in the nonprofit sector measurements, because it is really hard to measure whether or not you're saving the Amazon, for instance. You have much more tools in the for-profit sector to measure return on investment, P&L, market share. In our sector, if you're saving the planet, it's very complex to measure your progress toward that. But what I experienced at the Nature Conservancy is we began to take baby steps towards doing that, and it made a big difference.
Was there a particular event you would share with us, experience that kind of embodied what you're saying, and that don't want to put you on the spot?
You mean my mistakes
yeah,
or a success?
Either one. You can do either one.
Gosh, you know, well, let me just talk more generally, I guess, about change and changing an organization. When I worked at the Nature Conservancy, we went through this really rigorous process of setting forth a new strategy. And I don't know how many people here in the audience have actually read the Nature Conservancy case here. Has anybody read it? Nobody. Okay. Well, there's this...
it's a good case.
But we went through a process of developing a whole new strategy about focusing on a particular approach and making a couple of changes. And then we proceeded to try to make those changes happen in the organization overnight in a 3-4 month period. And the organization erupted. And it was the people in the organization erupted and fought it, but more importantly, the wellspring of support for the organization, which were the donors and the board members, who, by the way, don't have to be there. They could go do something else. They all fought it tooth and nail. And what we learned was you have to take an organization through a whole process of engagement and inclusion and making a change like that if you want to capture their hearts and minds. And that process of leading a nonprofit and leading its volunteers and working with them is an art form. And what I learned was to really take your time in doing that.
So switch now, you went to the World Wildlife. So my image of the World Wildlife, maybe I'm dating myself, is a panda or saving the tigers, and yet we're here to talk about environment. Would you just tell us a little bit about the organization?
Yeah, sure. So WWF is the world's largest conservation group. We work in 100 countries. We have a logo, which is a panda, and it's the ideal logo because it reproduces really well in black and white. And it is one of the most recognized logos on Earth. And when we do studies around the Earth, it is only surpassed by what Coca-Cola calls the dynamic ribbon and the Nike swoosh. And this panda logo is known everywhere. And in fact, when I worked at the Nature Conservancy, I was constantly annoyed that I would be in a dugout canoe in the Mosquito Coast, and I'd turn the corner, and there would be this panda on the side of a hut somewhere announcing some conservation program. And so for a lot of people, the logo represents saving animals. But our mission is all about saving big intact ecosystems like the Amazon, like the Bering Sea between Russia and Alaska, where, by the way, the U.S. catches most of its fish. And it is about working on big environmental issues like climate change. And so we have evolved to be an organization with over 4,000 employees around the world, some working in places like the Congo, some working in capital cities like Paris or London or Brussels, and combining this field-based work on big ecosystems with affecting markets like sustainable seafood or carbon markets or big international policies. And so it's very complex. It's a lot more complex than pandas. Although when I got this job, my wife said to me, well, above all else, you got to make sure the panda doesn't go extinct on your watch. And so far, so good. But our work is much more complex than that.
So when we think about big ecosystems and we think about the efforts to preserve them, we don't necessarily connect that with global corporations or business in general. What's the linkage there between your mission and the mission of businesses?
Okay, so from our point of view, the biggest force changing the earth and changing the places we care about are big corporations. So or big economic forces. So you think the Amazon, what's threatening the Amazon is local people cutting down trees. It's not. The Amazon is changing because it's being converted to soy in the southeastern corner for export to China to feed cows, to increase, to feed more people meat in China. And when to save the Amazon, you've got to work your way all the way upstream to the way people eat in China, which is counterintuitive. And when we're talking about whether it's the Amazon or the heart of Borneo or the Bering Sea, being able to affect these big market forces is really what it's all about, that and regulation. And so we've developed a whole series of programs to work on agricultural commodities, to work on timber, to work on fisheries, and to do so in collaboration with really big companies like Coca-Cola and HSBC and Walmart and Goldman Sachs.
So it's noble. I don't think anyone would disagree that we want to save these ecosystems. But on the other hand, what I'm hearing you say is that the market is driving the destruction to some degree, that the market is actually working, that people are being satisfied in terms of their need, growing soy, that there's a market. So is this actually the way that you engage with corporations, is to affect a market that's actually operating at a fairly efficient level, it would sound?
Yeah, you've got to affect the market. And I'm describing, at least from our point of view, why we work with corporations. There's also a reason why corporations work with us. And we heard earlier about the litany of GE. Their whole new strategy is eco-imagination. Goldman Sachs has just announced a whole new environmental policy. Walmart is building all kinds of new programs around the environment. And HSBC has announced that they're going to be completely carbon neutral. And the reason those companies are doing that, on the other hand, is one is they need to maintain their license to operate in countries. The other is to protect their supply chain, because we live in a world of finite resources. There are more people every day on the planet. Consumption is getting higher, and there's going to be conflict over that. And businesses that know how to navigate that equation have been shown to pick up market share. And they're beginning to develop new markets. That's one reason why Goldman Sachs is in this, is they see these emerging new markets around ecosystem services, or the value that an intact fishery or intact forest or intact river basins provide. And so they're beginning to work with us as well.
So if I were a skeptic, I might say that they're not doing it for any altruistic reasons. They're doing it because it's good for business. I mean, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. But is that what I'm hearing? That that's the driver behind it? That you're doing it because you believe in it, and they're doing it because they believe it's a market opportunity?
It's a little more complicated than that. So we've had a chance to work with Hank Paulson at Goldman Sachs. And anyone who's read about Hank Paulson, in addition to being a brilliant investor and negotiator, is someone who, in his heart of hearts, really profoundly believes in the environment and has done amazing things to move that organization because it's the right thing to do. And if you go to Goldman, there are countless partners at Goldman who are really involved in our cause, and it just permeates the whole organization. If you look at Walmart, Rob Walton sits on the board of Conservation International. His son sits on the board of Environmental Defense. They are deeply devoted to fly fishing, diving, and mountain climbing, and they want Walmart to do the right thing. And this fall I had a chance to attend this Clinton Global Initiative, where it was a mosh pit of CEOs, celebrities, and heads of state, all of whom are obsessed with the legacy they're going to leave behind as individuals. And they all are anxious to make statements that they are not just in business for business, they also, as a leader for a business or these institutions, they want to leave something behind that's going to make the world a better place. And it was fascinating to see them all try to outdo each other in this context, which is part of the magic of that event. And so I believe part of the equation is that leaders in these institutions are more than just businessmen or businesswomen. They are real people who care about real things and care about their legacy. And that's part of what motivates them to do the right thing.
And at the same time, they believe it's good business.
Yeah, they wouldn't do it if it hurt the bottom line.
So give us some examples of where it's good business for some of the corporations you work for. Not the sort of really obvious ones where they may put their label on a product, but something more complex, like around the Amazon or around saving an ecosystem that wouldn't seem so obvious.
So we've had a chance to work with the world's greatest brand, which is Coca-Cola. And I had dinner recently with the chairman of Coke, who talked about their future business plan, their 50-year vision. And if you think about Coke's market and how they produce their product, if Coke thinks about the future of the world and what's the greatest risk to their brand, it's the inability to produce their product. And they have done models with us about the future of watersheds around the world. And there are places where it is highly likely, either because of climate change or population pressures or water use, that the watersheds that bottling plants exist in will not have water. And so they are really anxious to get out ahead of that, to create more efficient water use within their plants, and also to work with us and local communities in creating more sustainable use of water in those larger watersheds. And we are on the verge, I probably shouldn't even talk about it,
It's
of
private,
announcing
you don't have to worry.
a major partnership with Coca-Cola around this issue. And it makes imminent good business sense. And it also means that they will have the additional benefit of being seen as a thought leader in the world of water the same way BP is seen in the world of energy. And that gets you a seat at the table with governments in a way that you don't have otherwise.
Now, shift to those partnerships. You modestly call your partnerships with corporations transformational partnerships. What does that mean, Carter? Tell us a little bit about it.
Look, I've worked in different places where the relationship with corporations is mostly about getting money out of them. And a lot of people, at least in the nonprofit sector, you desperately need money to work. In fact, it is the greatest limiting factor to a big chunk of what you do. And so a lot of your engagement with businesses is around looking for donations and looking for financial support. One of the interesting things about WWF is that our main measure of our work with corporations is changing corporate behavior. And it goes back to what I talked about earlier. You're not going to save the Amazon if you don't change the market forces that are changing it. And so what we seek to do is transform corporate behavior in terms of how Walmart sources its fish, or how HSBC lends its money to infrastructure projects, or how the World Bank designs poverty reduction projects in Africa. And we believe that that is a big part of how we're going to reduce the footprint that we leave on the earth as a society.
In fairness, when in putting on my CEO cap of a public company, Greenpeace also wants to affect behavior. So wouldn't I be a little bit worried about getting too close to you, Carter?
It's interesting. I actually went to the Amazon this past spring. And I went with the head of a big international lending bank. I went with a leading scientist, Tom Lovejoy, and I went with the head of an energy company. And we arrived in the Amazon. We went to Camp 41, this classic research site. We slept in hammocks, and the next morning we went out on the road. And every bumper sticker said, "Greenpeace, go home. The Amazon belongs to Brazilians." Because Greenpeace had just issued a broadside accusing Cargill, which is, many of you may not know Cargill, it's the world's biggest agricultural commodity company, privately held out of Minneapolis. And they accused Cargill of enslaving hundreds of thousands of people, breaking every environmental law in the book, and destroying the Amazon. Meanwhile, WWF was working with Cargill and others on a roundtable around soy production practices and defining and advancing new ways of producing soy where you get higher production and a smaller footprint so Cargill doesn't have to cut down as many trees. And so we play this middle ground between just looking for money and then tying rubber rafts to boats, which we don't do.
And it sounds like this is a long-term, sustainable kind of partnership that you're looking for.
That's the idea. But to be honest, there is a role for hard-hitting advocacy groups.
It's just not where you see
It's not what we do. And the reason I work at WWF is my own intuition and my own approach is to look for positive solutions and to try to bring people together. There are other people who are far better advocates and bomb throwers than I am.
Before we open it up for Q&A, I just want to ask one more question. What is the perception? You work with a lot of large corporations, and we hear that many business leaders have a stereotypical perception of the nonprofit sector. Not well managed, not really up to the task, not very efficient. What sense do you have in creating these partnerships? Are you an equal player at the table, or is there a disequilibrium here of power and perception?
That's a great, it varies. It's a great question.
It's my first good question.
Yeah. No, there were other good ones.
Good. Okay, I'm just checking out.
There are cases in which there's a great disequilibrium, but when that happens, to me, it's usually a bad sign that the company really doesn't care about the issue that we're talking about. What we bring to the table is we have a stable of scientists around the world who are evaluating and measuring the environmental impacts of corporate behavior or the environmental impacts of things like climate change. And that information and that integrity is really important to people who are either want to do the right thing or are under siege. And the other thing we bring is that we have programs in 100 countries. We operate at a global level, and we influence policies and regulations and work on the ground in all those places. And so right now we actually have companies beating down the door to come to us, to work with us, because they're operating in a global environment. They're trying to understand the impacts of their work on civil society and looking for somebody to work with them that is not only a feedback loop on that, but also a partner in navigating that. So for the most part, it feels equal. Of course, at the end of the day, it usually is voluntary. And where it becomes less voluntary is where either nations or states enact something, regulations related to climate change and forcing a reduction in CO2 emissions. And companies react to that, have to figure out a way to make progress on that, and then are seeking partners to help them get there.
And do you find that when it's an imposed need for them to seek you out, that the partnerships necessarily are less effective? Or is that a generalization that's not fair?
It really varies. It is a big, on the issue of, let's take the issue of climate change. There are lots of companies who want to work with us on climate change. And I'd say half of them are working with us because they know regulation's coming. It's already here in 20 states. It's in other countries, and they know it's coming. But another half see a big business opportunity, like I talked about, and a big business risk. We just released a report with Allianz. I was in New York with the chairman of Allianz, and we released a report for the insurance industry. And their losses due to catastrophes have doubled in the past 10 years. And they are calling on the whole insurance industry to begin to incorporate climate change in their risk modeling, because they are seeing the hurricanes, the fires, and the flooding and storm surge events as being the biggest change in their industry, and they're desperate to do something about it.
Let's turn it over to the audience for some questions. And I'm sorry, I have to point to you and say you don't have your class cards there. So we'll start off. Yes.
Could you please comment on the Bush administration's environmental policies over the last 6 years, and how you think those might change over the next couple of years given the recent election?
Yeah, well, it's very interesting working for an organization that's truly global. And I hear on a daily basis what the rest of the world thinks about the U.S. policies on the environment, but particularly climate change. And we will look back on these 8 years as an enormous missed opportunity to do something about climate change as a country, because we have treated international accords without much respect. We have not committed to emission reductions as a country, and we haven't treated other countries with as much respect on this issue as we should. The Bush administration has had the worst record on the environment of any administration history. And what's interesting about that is that all the great environmental laws were passed in Republican administrations. The Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Safe Water Drinking Act were all passed in the Nixon administration. And the great conservationist in the history of this country, Teddy Roosevelt, was a Republican. And so what we find is we're a nonpartisan group, first of all. And we find that this issue is essentially nonpartisan, that there's a lot of Republicans and Democrats who care about conservation and care about climate change. But this administration has chosen to not only ignore the scientific evidence, but has chosen to attack some of the environmental laws and the issues that we care about. And there's a chance for them to change in the next 2 years. But at least with this new Congress, we're going to be less on the defensive in defending the Endangered Species Act and defending science around climate change. And I think lay the groundwork for something good to happen 2 years from now.
Yes.
In the non-profit sector, like the for-profit sector, there's a competition. Non-for-profit sector is often a competition for funding or for mind space, for your policy to your advocacy. How do you position and how do you handle that competition vis-a-vis a Sierra Club or some other major, perhaps national brands in the US, where you're competing in this large market of people with a huge amount of cash to invest or consume, or both?
I wish I could tell you that that when you go from the for-profit to non-profit sector, everybody holds hands and sings Kumbaya and plays together. It is really true that there is competition for the hearts and minds of people for dollars, and even competition over ideas. And I'll give you an example. We work with corporations, and we want to work with corporations to really transform their practices. There are other nonprofits that work with corporations, and instead of setting the bar at the same level we do, they set it lower, and in some ways make it easier for a corporation to sign up for a lower standard of behavior, and that's a real problem. Probably the competition around dollars is an interesting one. I was just with the Packard Foundation on the West Coast, and Julie Packard, who runs the Monterey Aquarium, and we were talking, and we talked about making collaboration happen more between groups, and she said she would be so happy if they got a joint proposal from us and another group to work in the Gulf of California or the Coral Triangle or whatever, because I think the conviction is, first, we can legally collude between these groups, which is an option not available to some other sectors. And the second is, if we're really smart about defining our respective roles, then we could make amazing things happen. And I think that's the greatest challenge right now is, let's say, take the Amazon. We do amazing work on creating parks in the Amazon. We have a goal with the government of Brazil to create a system of parks the size of California, and we're halfway there. The Nature Conservancy works on indigenous reserves, which is another 20% of the Amazon. And there's no reason we shouldn't, given the fact that we're doing very different things, be able to come up with a joint vision and make some things happen together. And we're working on it. Our scientists play really well together. I think we're not at the point of actually, we've talked about a merger in a few places, and we've rejected that because the sense is that it is better to have our different brands and different approaches. But we are currently crafting a series of alliances and joint ventures. And the reason I went from the Nature Conservancy to WWF was I was working on a joint venture. And in the middle of that, my predecessor, Catherine Fuller, asked me to lunch and offered me a whole new job. And That's one of the downsides, I suppose. But I think that we need to do a lot more collaboration. We can legally do it. It just, at the end of the day, it requires on really good people who keep their eye on the mission to work together rather than compete.
Yes.
You said that companies are beating down your door to partner with you, and I know that this is the case for a lot of NGOs. What advice would you give to a nonprofit that has companies proposing partnerships? What are the key factors that they should evaluate in deciding who to partner with?
Yeah. The first principle is don't sell your virtue. And you really have to look at the motivation of the company that wants to work with you. And is it just to greenwash their activities, or is it really to do something new and fundamentally different? And so I think there are some companies we won't work with, or we won't accept money from because their track record and their sense of ethics is just not particularly strong. There are very few. But for the most part, to me, the thing I'd focus the most on is what are your goals as an organization, and will this relationship get you there? So for us, if what we've done is identified 20 places around the world that are our highest priorities, and we have identified what are those forces that are changing those places, and who are the market leaders around those forces, and those should be our priorities in terms of partnerships. And so instead of being opportunistic, we should really go after strategic partnerships that meet our ultimate goals. But the other thing I'd say is don't just announce a big fluffy partnership. You should have very specific measures of the kind of achievements you want to go after. So with HSBC, we have a goal of their becoming a zero net emissions in terms of CO2 use company. And we're working on a partnership with them towards that. And we'll announce progress toward that and celebrate it. And if they don't make progress toward that, we'll report on that as well. So that would be my advice.
Way back there.
I'll try and talk up. Have you at WWF made an explicit decision that partnering with corporations is perhaps a better or more efficient way, as opposed to lobbying for legislation and regulation?
I don't. You all heard the question. I don't see it as an either or. Let's take climate change. We are actively working with Walmart, Coca-Cola, Nike, IBM, the city of Aspen on CO2 emission reduction commitments and collaborating with them on that. At the same time, we know that we will not come close to approaching the problem unless we have a real cap-and-trade system of regulations in this country and internationally. And what's interesting is these companies who right now have to navigate 20 different state laws on this issue are also calling for regulations to create both a more consistent, kind of predictable regulatory environment, but also the market leaders like regulation because it's a barrier to entry to others. And so I don't consider it as a trade-off between the two. And in some cases, they're really mutually reinforcing, particularly with the best companies.
Would you just tell us what a cap-and-trade is?
Yeah, sorry. The idea of a cap-and-trade system is something that was pioneered with environmental defense around various particulates 20 years ago, is the idea of establishing a baseline of where we are in terms of emissions right now, either on pollutants or on CO2, setting a goal of either lowering that or freezing that and creating a cap, and then creating a mechanism in which companies can trade to reach that cap. So if one company goes lower than that cap, and in terms of their share of getting there, they can sell some of that progress toward another company that's above it. And so you create a market mechanism, but the basis for that is this regulatory cap that drives behavior.
So regulation that's actually creating a market.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
By 95, thanks, Chair. Kyoto was defeated by a vote of 95-0 in the Senate. One of the main reasons why senators and and much of Congress said that this was a bad idea was because China and India would not sign on and were unwilling to undertake similar cuts in emissions or limit their emissions in the future. So has that changed? What's changed where we might be able to see something different in the future? Have China and India's positions changed? Whose position has changed that things might be different?
It's a complicated issue. One really interesting thing about climate change, it is a truly global problem. When you cut down the forests in the Amazon and burn them, it affects the whole world's climate. The way we drive cars affects the whole world's climate. China's behavior does that. And so if you don't get China on board or the US on board in a truly international protocol, we're really not going to make progress on this issue at the level that we need to. What's changed, I think, is that in the past 2 years, there's been a tipping point in the public perception that this is not just some abstract issue that environmentalists care about, but it's an issue that really hits people's pocketbooks, it hits industry hard, and it creates these events that we've seen over the past 2 years that affects a lot of people's livelihoods. And so if you'd asked me 3 years ago what would be the issue that would galvanize the world community, I would have said water. I would not have said it was something like climate change. And yet, even National Geographic is devoting a whole issue to climate change. And it is the hot topic, one of the hot topics in the world right now. And so I think this, The Economist did a whole piece on climate change. I think the increased global perception that it is not just an environmental problem, it's a social problem, an economic problem, is going to be part of it. I think politics and changing politics in the US and in China and elsewhere is going to be a part of it. But at the end of the day, it's going to come down to these very interesting negotiations between countries who are in really different places. And God help us if they don't. But my sense right now is the most hopeful thing is there's this tipping point in public perception and also in the perception of big multinational corporations that this is a real issue that has to be dealt with.
Is that tipping point just in the US or is it globally?
It's everywhere. I mean, you look at the Stern report that just came out this past week in the UK, identified that climate change represents the ability to destroy between 5 and 20% of the GDP of the world's economy. And both parties in the UK have gotten behind this report and are campaigning with it. And you're going to begin to see those kind of politics in other countries as well.
Yes.
Can you tell me
Let's wait for the microphone. It seems to work.
Thanks. What is of the alliances or the collaborations that you've had with corporations? Can you talk a little bit about what the one that you've had the longest at this point, and what in the course of developing these different collaborations, have you noticed that over time they tend to change, or that there's certain factors where you know that one is going to last a long time as opposed to being kind of a short-term deal?
Let me think about the best example here. We have been working with HSBC out of London for many years. And initially, the relationship was all about freshwater conservation. That they saw that was a fundamental issue, people would care about it, and it affected every market in which they operated. And over time, we ended up exchanging staff. And the head of our conservation program in the UK became the head of their environmental program in HSBC. And we ended up having this overlap between our institutions around this set of issues. And that began this whole deep exchange. And as the issue of carbon and climate change emerged, the relationship has moved more toward thinking about their own behavior. And they have rewritten their lending policies around 5 sectors that relate to climate change, but both environmental impact as a result of this. They've also made a major commitment to be carbon neutral as an institution. And we'll see what happens next. But it has been this deep, abiding partnership in which there's been an exchange of staff, an evolution of thinking about their own role as a corporate citizen. And they feel like they've gotten enough out of it where they keep re-upping, and it evolves to a different set of issues that run the gamut from water to climate to their lending practices.
How long ago did this start, this partnership?
It started 8 years ago.
And are they have skin in the game in terms of money? I won't ask you how much, Carter, but...
They made 4 years ago, they made a $20 million commitment to support the freshwater work, which is pretty serious. And, but the bigger skin they have in the game is their lending practices. That's their bread and butter. And they have skin in the game in terms of how much they spent to make themselves CO2 neutral. And I don't know what that number is, but it's a big number.
Yes, let's go.
Have you experienced internal conflict about engaging business? And if so, how have you managed that?
It's interesting. We have debates about, the debates we have are on the issue of are we pushing a company enough to really change their behavior to the point where announcing a partnership protects our brand. So we have this, part of the power of the panda is our brand reputation. It's interesting reading all these articles that have come out recently about the value of corporations, how much of that value is about brands, something so intangible instead of real bricks and real capital assets and people. And it's the thing that we care the most about is making sure that our credibility around the world is not diminished by any of these partnerships. And so the debates we have is where do you draw that line? Is a 10% reduction in the amount of water that Coca-Cola uses throughout its 1,000 bottling plants enough? Or is there more that you need before we announce a partnership? With Walmart, we just worked with Walmart. Walmart committed to source, they're the second biggest seafood buyer in the United States. And they just committed to source all of their seafood in 3 years from sustainably certified fisheries, which has scared the heck out of the seafood industry. And so the question we're asking right now is, in working with Walmart, how do we ensure that enough fisheries convert to sustainable levels to make that real? And so we didn't commit to that unless there was also a commitment to devote the resources to work with fishermen all around the world to make those changes. And so I think those are the biggest debates we have, is let's not sell our virtue. That's why people want to work with us. And the more you lower the bar, the less your brand means to anybody.
Just to interject a question following on that. It's one thing to make a commitment for a corporation. It's another thing to execute.
Yeah.
So what insurance do you have that they will execute on the commitment? How do you monitor it? And will you pull out of a deal if they don't? I mean, $20 million is, I raised money for a nonprofit. I know how hard that is. It's a lot of money.
I mean, for us at the end of the day, it's not about the money, it's about the goals. And if a company we work with blinks on the goals, then typically we won't do the deal. And a lot of the work we do doesn't involve money at all. I'll give you one example. 80% of the money that is lent in the world comes from banks who have all committed to a set of principles called the Equator Principles, which is a set of principles that commits them to only lend money in a way that does not harm indigenous people, doesn't harm the environment, and addresses a whole array of other social issues. All they've done is make that commitment. The question is, are they following through on it? And so we have now begun to work with a series of organizations on creating something called Bank Track, which evaluates and rates all of these banks on their execution against this. And we announce it every year at Davos, where the CEOs gather together and are really concerned about their reputation. And so, so that's one way of holding people accountable. And we have pulled out of deals where the commitment really wasn't there.
Yes.
Could you comment a little bit on the impact that your work has on sustainable development and livelihoods in the indigenous communities and poverty alleviation and all of that? I mean, you started to talk a little bit about the impact on a lot of fisheries, and as we know, in large parts of the world, it's a cottage industry, and raising the standards all of a sudden could have an impact on livelihoods.
This is this whole issue of how does the environment relate to people is a big issue today. And you know, one of the mistakes I think the environmental movement made 20 years ago was talking about our work as something out there, that it's all about beautiful fuzzy animals, pristine wilderness, and there isn't any place that's pristine. Every place we work, there are people there, there's economic value there, the world sees it, they want to use it, and the world at large, particularly right now, is really, really focused on poverty issues, and particularly on Africa. And if you just look at the big campaigns and the celebrities who are going to Africa and working on these issues, it's reflective of a larger trend to really worry about people and their livelihoods in the poorest places on earth. And so we have been attacked for being not sensitive enough to those issues. And in some places, I think that's unfair, and in other places, there's room for improvement. But we are realizing that we have to make our work absolutely relevant to people in those places if it's going to last in any way. If you just come in to the Amazon and you put up a park, local people don't benefit in any way, that park is going to be a park on paper only. It's not really going to exist long term. And this summer, I went to Mozambique, where I had a chance to visit some of our work off the coast of Mozambique, where the local communities who have had their fisheries completely wiped out by big commercial fleets coming from other countries have asked us to work with them in creating marine reserves that keep big commercial fleets out, preserve rights for local fishermen. And 4 years later, they have reported to us that they're catching more fish and bigger fish, and people are being fed better as a result. And to me, I think that's the future of conservation. And the more we build on those models, the better.
Yes. Wait.
You mentioned your work at the Nature Conservancy on sort of putting into place a new major strategy for them. Yeah. And I understand that world wildlife is also going through some sort of major strategic changes now. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, or sort of about the motivation for the change in strategy that you guys are going through, and maybe how what you've learned in the past is affecting the way you're trying to implement that.
Yeah. So when I first started, the first thing I did was fly around the country and talk to all of our major donors, and talk to all of our major partners, and talk to people, just smart people, and ask them what they thought about WWF. And the first thing they said was, killer logo. And the second thing they said was, you guys are all over the world. And the third thing they said was, you guys are all over the map. That you are the Sears Roebuck of conservation. That you do everything. And I'm not sure if I can define any one singular thing that you do that really is hitting the ball out of the park. And then the second question I asked the whole organization, what are we most proud of? And people began to describe these cases in which we started to work, and I'll give you one example, in a place called, in the island of Sumatra. We started to work on tigers, and we started to work on rhinos, and we realized we had to work on creating parks. And then we realized the parks, even when created, were getting cut down by Asia Pulp and Paper, this mammoth company that's out of China. And then we realized that every time we reached an accord with them, they cheated on the accord. So then what we did is we went all the way upstream. We started working with Staples and IKEA in Sweden, and we started working with Ricoh in Japan, who bought their paper from Asia Pulp and Paper. And we began to work with them on changing their purchasing specs. And all this went all the way back down, where Asia Pulp and Paper committed to set aside areas to eliminate their concessions and it led to the populations of tigers and rhinos rebounding in some of those areas we talked about. And that became a touchstone for what we call this local to global approach that takes advantage of what's unique about WWF, which is we're big, we're global, and it takes advantage of those moments where we connect the dots between our presence in Sweden, our presence in Japan, our presence in the US, and our presence in Indonesia. And when we do that, we do things that nobody else can do. And so our new strategy is to pick 20 places around the world where we can build these local to global efforts and get our whole network to commit to those 20 places into certain actions. And it's beginning to pay off in places like the Amazon and also the Bering Sea off the coast of Alaska.
Thanks.
Yes.
Hi. This follows up on your recent comments, and I've been constantly reminded that WWF, of course, is a conservation organization, and I'm wondering, how do you make any effort to prioritize the conservation issues or the places that you're working in? For example, do you look to find areas that do you evaluate a site where you promote an initiative on the basis of what species are in the area, if you have an initiative that's likely to succeed in that area, and how you might take an initiative that might be a livelihoods initiative or a product initiative forward into the market, or is that too low a scale for you to work on?
I'll describe our priority setting process. I'll just give you a top line. It was more complex than you'd want to know. But we have mapped the whole world into 857 ecoregions, which are these areas that are biologically consistent. So the Galapagos is one, the Northern Great Plains in the US is one, the Atlantic Forest in Brazil is one. And then we've created a computer program that tracks the number of known vertebrate species in each of those places. And to the degree we have other types of data. And we prioritized this set of ecoregions down to about 120 based on those that had the greatest number of species and as a solution set would save the world's biodiversity. If you could save these 100, you would pick up most of the species found in the 850 worldwide. And then we looked at that set and we said, in the next 10 years, where are we going to make the biggest difference based on the stars lining up, based on local capacity, based on political will, and we took it down to 20, which is actually, some of those are aggregations. So it's about 40 in the context of 20. And at the end of the day, what we're promising people is not that we're going to save the earth, but that we're going to save these places and create models and hope for people. And we're going to focus our resources on these because they have a ton of species. We believe the conditions are right to make a difference. And they also serve as platforms for these upstream programs we're working on.
Well, I'm a little bit confused because you said you were working with ecosystems, and
Yeah.
there are ecosystems which are critically important, but they don't have the most species in them.
Right.
So
We
how
made
do you-
we made a choice that the number of species is really, really important. And so for the most part, the portfolio I've described are those places where biologically you get the biggest bang for your buck. I still haven't answered your question.
No, you've answered it, but there's a great deal of controversy and published scientific data that suggests that interactions between species are very important, and just the number of species is not some of the biological cold spots. For example, the savannas, which are less diverse, are very important ecologically, but they aren't where the most species are.
Yeah, so
how do you take care of those areas to support your species-rich areas?
we have a couple of those, but for the most part, you have to make choices. And the last thing in the world I'd ever suggest is that the ecosystem of the Georges Bank or the ecosystem of the savannas were unimportant. All I'm suggesting is that in the grand scheme of things, what we're focusing on are those landscapes where we believe we can make a big difference, and also where we believe that we'll get a big bang for our buck biologically. We're not saying that cold spots are unimportant. It's just as a matter of emphasis, we're putting more emphasis on those places with more species, but not as an absolute rule. You look at the Bering Sea. The Bering Sea is the biggest fishery for the United States. It has amazing species there. It doesn't have the number of species of the rainforests in Brazil or Papua New Guinea. We do some work there. But as a general rule, we do favor the richer environments for species more than the ones that are less rich. But I'd never say that the other ones are unimportant. I just say, here's where we're placing our bet.
Time for one more question. Yes.
This is just in line with some of the others. Could you talk a little bit about what it's been like getting this global organization to shift and change and execute on this transition, and what some of the pain points have been?
Well, it's hard. It's really hard to change a global organization. And it's interesting. This is the biggest difference from where I've come from and the organization I'm a part of is if you're in one single organization, single 501c3 that you have complete control over, you can push a button and things happen. When you're a part of a global organization, you need to listen to the points of view of people in very different cultures. And yet my conviction is that if you really want to save the Amazon, the U.S. isn't going to do it alone. If you want to make progress on climate change, we're not going to do it just by the U.S. advancing a domestic cap and trade system. It's got to be part of an international protocol that brings along India, brings along China. And so the struggles we have, I think, are reflective of the broader issue of how the world comes together to solve problems. And the pressure points to me are real cultural differences. You can't underestimate how different the world looks from Europe than it does from the United States. And on a whole array of issues, big political ones, small social ones. It's really interesting. And so what we have to do is devote a lot of time to bringing together my colleagues from Europe, from South America, from here and from China, bring them together in one place, usually if it's the Amazon, in the Amazon, map out what our aspirations are in the Amazon, and get everybody to commit and sign in blood what the approach we're going to take and the commitments we all make, and to treat that as a binding agreement on all of us on what we're going to do together. And that approach, which is kind of a federation approach, has begun to work really well. But you've got to devote time to it. And I suspect it's the same for any other social issues that are global in nature. So it's overcoming these cultural differences, bringing people together and agreeing on things. But you can't underestimate the cultural differences. And the world does not, we have some real issues in how the world sees the U.S. and its leadership on certain issues these days. And so you have to devote a lot of time to navigating that and getting together with other people.
Just to add additional texture to that, how many separate World Wildlife Organizations are there in the globe?
There are 26 operating in 100 countries. When I say 26 that have their own boards, we are far and away the biggest here in the United States, and we're also the home for science program, the work with the World Bank, and also a lot of the Latin America programs are under our umbrella. But it's complex, and yet I think it's reflective of the way the world works these days.
But just to understand the complexity, 26 organizations, each with their separate board, each with their own fundraising, and basically each operating, although they have the same name, with some degree of independence, or a great degree.
Some degree of independence. But I think we've all realized that you're not going to make progress, given the global nature of what's affecting these ecosystems. You can't make progress unless you come together. In the Congo, we're creating a series of parks. But the big threats are coming from Europe, and they're coming from French logging companies. And so no matter what we do, if WWF France isn't working on the behavior of French logging companies, we're not really going to make a lot of progress.
So Carter, before you just give us a couple of parting remarks, we speculated on the makeup of all of you students. So I just want to ask a couple of questions. How many of you students plan on going into business, the for-profit, when you graduate? Show of hands. And how many of you plan on going directly into the nonprofit organization? So not too many. And one last question. Of those of you who are going into for-profit, I missed something because you haven't all voted, you know. We don't have you, we can't identify you, but of those of you who are going into the for-profit, how many of you someday would like to be in the social sector, run a nonprofit organization? So a fair number. So Carter, as you leave, it would be interesting to just give us your sense, your wisdom, you know, as to what should they be doing as they are in the for-profit world, thinking about someday making this transition. You made it rather early on in your career. It was serendipitous you found a slot. But what advice would you give for most of these students who someday want to go into the nonprofit world? It may be 10 years out, it may be 20 years out. How do they become credible in the nonprofit sector?
Yeah, it's interesting because I described my early attempts to get in, and it was hard. But the advice I'd give is to think really hard about what you care about. Are you happy with the way the world looks? Do you think the world needs help? And I'm not just talking about our issue, it could be any social issue. And think about what you want to leave behind. A lot of people I talk to have real existential concerns about what they're going to leave behind. And it's not just the amount of money you earn, but what's the legacy that you're going to have? And you see Bill Gates and Warren Buffett and Jeff Skoll and all these amazingly successful people are turning their mind to what is their legacy going to be? And it's more than Microsoft and Google and Berkshire Hathaway. It is their ability to influence the way the world is going to look, either in terms of poverty or human health or the environment. And what I at least have seen, and you talk to somebody like Hank Paulson, is that he regularly talks about the things he cares about, including the way Goldman Sachs operated. And all of these individuals have an ongoing conversation about the way the world is, what they worry about, and what they might be able to do about it. And I've seen people make an extraordinary difference either in working for a nonprofit full-time, working on a board of a nonprofit, giving money away. And there is this great blurring between the private sector and the nonprofit sector in making a difference. And one of my favorite examples is this guy, Jeff Skoll, who you may know was one of the early founders of eBay. He invented a movie production company called Participant Productions. And he has produced The Constant Gardener, North Country, an array of movies that have advanced certain social agendas while also making money. And it's real. The Google founders are doing that. And on the nonprofit side, I'm finding that nonprofits are beginning to dip into the for-profit world, as I've talked about. And in the middle of all this, I think are real people who have real concerns about how they're going to make a difference in the world. And that whether it's in the interviews you do or the way you talk to your employees or the way you talk to your friends, being really honest about the things you care about, the difference you want to make, you will find opportunities to do that either now or you'll find it in your business later. And what I'm seeing in the world is that a lot of people in the business sector are moving a lot of their energies in this direction, and the companies are really encouraging of that. And so I remember sitting here and interviewing for jobs and going to all the shrimp dinners and with Goldman Sachs and McKinsey and Microsoft. And it's really easy to get directed into those organizations that are recruiting hard here. And they're all great organizations, but I would also encourage you to be really honest about the things you care about and network, talk to people who have jobs you're interested in, who do work you're interested in, and look for opportunities, because they may not come up right away, but they will come up, those opportunities. And I think particularly people from this institution can make an enormous difference in the world. And you should really look for those opportunities and make that a part of your everyday conversation wherever you are.
Thank you. Now, am I correct in saying there's a reception after this? So Carter will be available. Regrettably, I have another commitment. But first of all, I'd like to thank all of you for coming and for those wonderful questions. And Carter, thank